They say every old house has its secrets, but few dare to speak of the ones buried inside Blackwood Manor. Perched on the windswept edges of Yorkshire's moors, its silhouette has loomed against the horizon since 1903, a monument of stone and shadow, admired for its grand halls yet avoided for reasons no tourist guide would ever print. By daylight, the manor appears like a relic of aristocratic ambition, sweeping staircases, vast dining rooms, portraits of a proud lineage. But as dusk falls, the locals tighten their doors and whisper of curses that cling to its walls. The strangest detail is not its crumbling wings or its iron-locked chambers, but its mirrors. Everyone inside, no matter how polished, refuses to reflect a human face. Visitors claim they see only blurred shapes, smeared shadows, or, at times, figures standing just behind them. Scholars argue about warped glass or tricks of candlelight, yet no rational inspection has explained why reflections vanish here, as though the house itself rejects the living. For the villagers of Blackwood, wealth and ruin have always walked hand in hand, and the Blackwood family embodied that duality. Lord Alistair Blackwood was remembered as a man of generosity, offering bread to the poor and sponsoring schools, yet stories persist of midnight gatherings where chants seeped from shuttered rooms. To some, he was a patron saint of progress. To others, he was a devil cloaked in civility. The manor became a theater of contrasts, aristocratic grandeur woven with unspeakable dread. Rooms once alive with music and laughter stand now with doors bolted shut, as though the very walls beg to keep their silence intact. Children growing up in nearby villages are warned never to cross the gates, and those who did often returned pale and trembling, speaking of corridors that stretched longer than they should, or of whispers calling their names. The most disturbing thread in the manor's history is not its crumbling architecture, but the fate of those who dared to own it. Records show that within a year of purchase, every inhabitant either disappeared or died under circumstances that polite society prefers to call unfortunate. A fall from a staircase, an illness with no diagnosis, an accidental fire, each more improbable than the last. Superstitious minds insist the locked rooms hold the answers, chambers sealed with iron long ago, as if the builders themselves wished to bury what should never be released. What secrets were those rooms meant to contain, and why did no Blackwood heir survive them long enough to confess the truth? Today, Blackwood Manor stands abandoned, its windows blind, its halls silent, yet its reputation alive and venomous. Some claim that the curse has outlasted the family, attaching itself to anyone reckless enough to enter. Others insist it is nothing more than myth, born from centuries of gossip and fear. But as you step closer to the story, one question will not leave you. Is the house cursed by the sins of its masters? Or does the manor itself breathe, watching, waiting, and choosing who will be swallowed next? Every curse has a beginning, and for Blackwood Manor, its roots lie deep in the final decades of the 18th century, when England stood poised between Enlightenment reason and the lingering shadows of superstition. In those years, aristocratic estates rose like monuments to ambition, meant to outlast the frailty of human lives. Among them was Lord Alistair Blackwood, the man whose name would forever entwine with the manor that bore it. His reputation was a study in contradictions, a figure of refinement and generosity in daylight, but whispered to consort with darker forces when the lamps burned low. Even today, when scholars debate whether Blackwood's legacy should be remembered as benevolent or cursed, the line between truth and myth remains blurred, like the shifting shadows that seem to haunt the manor itself. Lord Alistair was born in 1758, the heir to a modest but respectable lineage. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not squander his youth in gambling dens or idle leisure. Instead, he cultivated an image of discipline and intellect. Letters from Cambridge describe him as a man of voracious curiosity, studying mathematics and natural philosophy by day, while borrowing esoteric texts under candlelight at night. His peers admired his brilliance but noted an unsettling intensity, as though knowledge itself could never satisfy him. When he inherited his father's fortune at the age of 25, he announced plans to build a grand estate on a stretch of land known for its desolate beauty, a moorland cut by winds that howled like ancient voices. That land would become the foundation of Blackwood Manor. The construction began in 1784, with masons, carpenters, and laborers summoned from across the county. Villagers at first rejoiced at the steady employment, grateful for the wages and the prosperity Alistair promised to bring. He paid generously, commissioned a chapel, and donated coin to repair the village school. By outward measure, he appeared the very model of enlightened aristocracy. a man who believed in progress, in charity, in the improvement of common lives. Yet even in these early days, rumors gathered like storm clouds around the rising walls of his estate. Workers complained of being ordered to build certain chambers without windows, sealed with doors of iron rather than oak. Others whispered that the foundation stones were laid not in daylight, but under moonless skies, with Lord Alistair himself presiding over the rituals. Some claimed he buried objects beneath the manor, animal bones, jars of ash, fragments of ancient texts, though no proof has ever been unearthed. Here lies the first contrast of the curse's origin. To the villagers, Lord Alistair was both benefactor and predator, saint and sorcerer. Church records show his regular attendance at Sunday services, donations to clergymen, and even sponsorship of hymnals. Yet in private letters exchanged between local rectors, doubts creep through the language. One minister described feeling a chill, unnatural and sudden upon shaking Alistair's hand. Another refused to bless the manor's east wing, citing troublesome whispers he heard during the night of consecration. Psychology might call these suspicions projections of envy or fear, but folklore insists they were the first signs that the Blackwoods had invited something otherworldly into their halls. The contradictions only deepened as the manor neared completion in 1789. The architecture itself seemed to embody a dual nature, sweeping ballrooms lined with mirrors and chandeliers, yet corridors that narrowed inexplicably, ending in locked doors with no known keys. Visitors praised the elegance of the dining room, while servants reported rooms that echoed with sounds even when empty. One carpenter, dismissed after refusing to work in the cellar, later swore that he heard chanting beneath the floors, low voices reciting words in no language he recognized. He left the village altogether, claiming he would not remain near a house that swallows sound like a grave. But the question that lingers is this: was Alistair Blackwood a man pursuing forbidden knowledge, or was he merely a victim of rumor, maligned by those who could not comprehend his eccentricities? Psychologists argue that his intellectual obsessions, combined with a perfectionist temperament, could easily fuel paranoia among servants and laborers. He was known to dismiss staff abruptly, sometimes after only a few days, which might have fostered resentment. Yet others point to the odd disappearances recorded during construction. Parish logs mention 3 young men, laborers by trade, who vanished without explanation. Their families petitioned for inquiries, but the cases dissolved into silence. Some villagers whispered they had run off to the city, lured by opportunity. Others insisted their bones lay beneath the manor, cemented into the very walls. By the dawn of the 19th century, Blackwood Manor stood complete, a mansion of striking grandeur, its turrets piercing the sky, its gardens arranged with mathematical precision. Lord Alistair hosted lavish gatherings where scholars, artists, and politicians mingled beneath glittering chandeliers. Guests spoke of his eloquence, his charm, his ability to weave conversation from philosophy to poetry. To many he seemed the epitome of enlightenment, yet amid the laughter of banquets unease festered. Musicians reported that their instruments fell out of tune inside certain rooms, though perfectly fine elsewhere. A visiting painter found that portraits made within the manor refused to hold clarity. The faces he painted blurred after drying, as though the oils resisted permanence. Such stories may sound like superstition, but they multiplied with troubling consistency, feeding the notion that something unseen lingered in the manor's design. Religion, too, cast its long shadow. The local priesthood, though dependent on Alistair's donations, grew wary of him. He was accused, quietly, never openly, of hosting clandestine gatherings with men known to dabble in occultism. Letters discovered decades later mentioned the Society of the Veil, an esoteric circle rumored to study rituals of immortality. Was Lord Alistair a devoted student of forbidden arts, or merely a wealthy man indulging in eccentric intellectual clubs? The answer depends on whom one asks. To his admirers, he was a visionary exploring the boundaries of knowledge. To his critics, he was a heretic bargaining with forces best left untouched. The tension between philanthropy and corruption defined his later years. He continued to endow the village, funding mills and repairing bridges, acts that saved lives and livelihoods. Yet for every gift he bestowed, another rumor arose. Servants spoke of children lured into the manor to serve as pages, never seen again. Diaries from a housemaid described corridors that seemed to change length from one night to the next, as though the house itself resisted stability. Rational minds argue that such tales were inventions of frightened workers in a time of superstition. Still, even rationalists admit the unsettling pattern. Disappearances did occur, and they clustered around Blackwood's estate. The origins of the curse, then, may not lie in a single event but in the accumulation of contradictions, acts of kindness shadowed by whispers of cruelty, architectural marvels tainted by inexplicable anomalies, a family legacy written in both light and darkness. Psychology would suggest that fear and rumor can shape collective memory, exaggerating eccentricities into legends of horror. Religion, however, offers another explanation, that Lord Alistair, in his pursuit of knowledge and control, invited forces beyond human comprehension into his home. Once opened, such doors can never truly be closed. By 1805, Alistair's health declined, though no physician could name the illness. Witnesses reported that his reflection grew faint in mirrors, a detail dismissed by some as metaphor but repeated too consistently to ignore. On his deathbed, he allegedly forbade his heirs from entering the East Wing, commanding that its doors remain locked for all time. "Do not wake what sleeps," he is said to have whispered with his final breath. Whether this was the delirium of a dying man, or the confession of one who had trafficked with darkness, none can say. His heirs obeyed for a time. The legacy of Lord Alistair Blackwood left the manor both blessed and cursed. Blessed with wealth, cursed with whispers that only grew louder in his absence. For the villagers, his death marked not the end of unease, but the beginning of it. The sealed rooms became objects of speculation, and the house itself seemed to brood, its silence heavier than before. Those who walked past after nightfall claimed they heard faint music, or saw figures in windows that should have been empty. And though the manor still hosted gatherings under his descendants, the joy seemed hollow, the laughter strained, as though the very stones remembered what had been buried beneath them. Thus the origins of the curse entwine history with myth, psychology with faith, and light with shadow. Was Lord Alistair a man undone by ambition, or a visionary punished for seeking forbidden truths? Did he create a legacy of fear through cruelty and secrecy? Or did the manor itself become an echo chamber of human anxieties? The records remain divided, the evidence fragmented, and the debates unresolved. What endures, however, is the certainty that Blackwood Manor was never merely a house. It was, from its foundation, a paradox, both sanctuary and prison, both triumph and tomb. And as history would soon prove, its tragedies were only beginning. The first tragedies tied to Blackwood Manor emerged not long after its grand halls echoed with music and laughter, when the estate had scarcely settled into the soil of the valley. To outsiders, the manor seemed a beacon of wealth and stability, its stone walls unyielding and its windows aglow with refinement. Yet the villagers who worked the land beneath those towers whispered that such brightness was always accompanied by shadow, and shadows at Blackwood grew longer than the setting sun. It began subtly, with disappearances that the family dismissed as accidents or the flight of disloyal servants. But in the village, where rumor carried further than fact, the stories took root. The manor, they said, was not a place of ordinary life but a house that demanded sacrifice. And those who crossed certain thresholds within its walls vanished into a silence that felt too deliberate to be explained away by chance. The earliest documented case is found in the parish registers of 1794, where the sudden absence of a maid named Beatrice is recorded with little detail, marked only as departed. Her family insisted she had no reason to leave, no suitor waiting in another town, no debts or disgraces that might have driven her away. Her brother, a fisherman, swore that Beatrice had written only the day before her disappearance describing her duties in the manor kitchen, nothing unusual save that she felt watched when carrying trays down the eastern corridor. Servants later said that she complained often of the feeling, and on her last evening, she had been tasked with preparing Lady Eleanor's chamber. She carried linens and candles into the East Wing, and was never seen again. Officially, the explanation was simple. She had eloped, or perhaps fallen into the river on her way home. But villagers believed the walls of the East Wing had taken her, as if the very house had inhaled her presence and refused to exhale her back. A year later, tragedy touched the family directly. Lady Eleanor Blackwood, young wife to Lord Alistair's heir, Henry, had given birth to a son in winter and was still frail in body and spirit when her decline began. Records kept by the family physician describe her mood as unstable, her nerves unsettled by sleepless nights and the strain of confinement. Yet the accounts of servants and neighbors paint a darker picture. They spoke of her nightly wanderings into the East Wing, of her insistence that she heard voices in the walls, of her sudden shrieks that echoed so violently through the halls that villagers in the square claimed they carried on the wind. The physician called it postpartum madness, a fragile mind unraveling beneath the weight of motherhood. But others whispered that Lady Eleanor had seen something within the sealed chambers of the manor, something no mind, fragile or not, was meant to endure. One night her cries were louder than before, piercing and frantic as if she were begging for rescue from unseen hands. When servants rushed to her chamber, they found the cradle empty and Lady Eleanor standing by the window, her nightgown torn, her eyes wide with terror. The child was discovered unharmed hours later in the nursery, though no one could explain how he had been moved there. Lady Eleanor herself could not account for the event. She muttered incoherent fragments about faces in the plaster and breathing in the stones. Days later, she fell into a silence that even her most attentive ladies-in-waiting could not break, and by spring she was dead. Her passing described simply as an illness of the spirit. The village, however, never accepted that explanation. They said the East Wing had taken her voice, her reason, and finally her life, just as it had taken Beatrice before her. Not all victims perished in shadowed rooms. Some deaths were explained in ways that seemed plausible at first glance, yet bore the strange signature of the manor all the same. A stable hand named Robert was found lifeless at the base of the grand staircase, his neck broken, his eyes fixed in an expression of unspeakable dread. The official account was that he had stumbled after a night of drinking, but his companions swore he had been sober when he left the tavern. They remembered him pale and trembling, insisting he had been ordered to carry tools into a locked storage room in the East Wing, though he refused to say why. Some villagers believe he fell not from drink, but from something that pursued him unseen down the steps. The breathless way his body was found, as if mid-scream, fueled their certainty. The deaths came in intervals, never so frequent as to empty the household of servants, but persistent enough to create a pattern too chilling to ignore. A gardener went missing while trimming the hedges near the East Wing windows. His shears were discovered still upright in the soil, the blades sunk as though pressed there in sudden haste. A governess collapsed at supper, convulsing until she choked, though no poison could be found in her meal. Each time the official records offered rational causes: illness, accident, misadventure. Yet the villagers repeated the same refrain: the house itself was choosing. And always, when gossip reached its fevered pitch, Lord Alistair's descendants issued statements of denial, insisting that superstition had no place in their halls. Still, the echoes of screams across stone and the silent disappearance of servants spoke louder than any rebuttal. Of all these stories, Lady Eleanor's remained the most haunting, for it bore the dual weight of official record and whispered folklore. Scholars who later studied her case disagreed sharply. Was she merely a victim of melancholia, a mind undone by circumstance, or had she glimpsed a truth beyond the veil of sanity? Some psychologists suggested her visions of faces in the plaster were classic symptoms of hallucination, a brain straining against grief and exhaustion. Others, particularly those drawn to the supernatural, argued that her breakdown aligned too precisely with the timing of her nocturnal visits to the East Wing to be coincidence. They pointed to the fact that her son, the infant Henry, grew into a man plagued by recurring nightmares of suffocation and shadow, as if some part of his mother's terror had been imprinted upon him. Folklore embellished her story further still. Generations of villagers retold how Eleanor's screams could be heard on stormy nights, echoing faintly from the crumbling East Wing windows. Travelers claimed to have seen a pale figure wandering near the sealed doors, her gown dragging along the floor, her mouth open in endless plea. Skeptics dismissed such sightings as tricks of weather and imagination, yet the tales endured because they carried the weight of possibility. That Eleanor's suffering had not ended with her death, but had bound her spirit to the very walls that had broken her mind. These first victims, Beatrice, Robert, Eleanor, and the nameless few whose records were lost or erased, laid the foundation for the manor's reputation as a place where tragedy was not incidental, but inevitable. Each death or disappearance deepened the chasm between official record and popular belief, drawing a line between the rational explanations of physicians and magistrates and the darker convictions of villagers who saw in the manor something beyond reason. And as the decades passed, the stories hardened into a pattern, until they no longer seemed like isolated misfortunes, but the early steps of a curse taking shape. By the time the 19th century dawned, Blackwood Manor was spoken of with reverence and dread in equal measure. To some, it was the home of a noble family whose griefs were no greater than those suffered by countless others. To others, it was a structure alive with hunger, its halls designed not only for living but for consuming. And it was in this tension, between illness and apparition, accident and intention, psychology and supernatural, that the true story of the first victims was suspended, never fully resolved. The official records remain, with their neat explanations and tidy diagnoses, but so too do the rumors, the folklore, and the shivers of unease that run through anyone who dares to walk the eastern corridors. For if the earliest deaths could be dismissed, however uneasily, as accidents or madness, the tragedies yet to come would make denial far more difficult, and the need for answers more urgent than ever. It was after these first victims, after Eleanor's final silence and the community's whispered suspicions, that the pursuit of rational explanations began in earnest. Physicians, scholars, and skeptics sought to bring science into the manor's shadow, to push back against the swell of superstition that threatened to engulf both family and village alike. But as history would show, reason had little power in Blackwood Manor, where the line between madness and the supernatural remained ever fragile, and where the first victims were only the beginning of a legacy steeped in death, fear, and unanswered questions. Throughout the 19th century, Blackwood Manor drew not only whispers, but also attention from the learned men of the age, physicians, priests, and skeptics who believed that rational inquiry or holy ritual might finally put to rest the shadowy stories that haunted the estate. Each group came with its own arsenal. Doctors with their diagnoses of hysteria and melancholia, priests with their rites of exorcism and relics, and natural philosophers armed with instruments of sound, light, and geometry. Yet for every attempt to explain or cleanse the manor, the house seemed to shift and resist, as though mocking those who sought to contain it. Science and superstition clashed within those walls, but both found themselves humbled by the strange persistence of the curse. The physicians were among the first to intrude upon the manor's mysteries, their notebooks filled with the new language of psychology. Madness, they argued, was the only rational explanation for the Blackwood tragedies. Lady Eleanor's screams, the servants' disappearances, the tales of breathing walls, these were, they claimed, the products of fragile minds unraveling beneath stress and isolation. One London doctor, Charles Wentworth, was especially determined to dismiss the supernatural. He arrived in 1821 armed with little more than a thermometer, a stethoscope, and an unshakable belief in reason. He spent several weeks interviewing villagers and servants, writing long reports in which he confidently attributed every strange occurrence to nervous hysteria, a diagnosis he applied not only to Lady Eleanor's case but also to the testimony of those who insisted they had seen apparitions. Yet his confidence faltered when, during one of his nightly walks through the East Wing, he claimed to hear a chorus of whispers that grew louder the farther he stepped into the corridor. Though he dismissed the sound as the wind through cracks in the stone, villagers noted how pale he looked when he left the manor, and how quickly he returned to London afterward. Priests, too, sought to confront the manor. To them, the tragedies spoke not of madness but of possession, of demonic presences lured by the sins of Lord Alistair and his rumored occult ties. Several exorcisms were attempted over the decades, each ending in failure. In 1834, Father Donnelly, a Jesuit with a reputation for driving out evil, arrived with holy water, incense, and a crucifix said to have touched the relics of saints. He began the ritual in the chapel, chanting prayers of deliverance, but as he proceeded into the East Wing, the candles extinguished themselves one by one, though no wind could be felt. Servants described how the air grew thick and the floorboards trembled, and how the priest himself staggered, clutching his chest as though struck by unseen force. He survived, but barely, and left declaring the place a house where heaven does not tread. Later priests were more cautious, offering blessings from afar rather than venturing inside. The skeptics, however, believed neither in hysteria nor demons, but in natural phenomena that the age of science had not yet fully understood. They brought instruments, tuning forks to test acoustics, mirrors to trace the play of light, and compasses to measure magnetic pull. One investigator, Professor James Holloway of Oxford, spent months studying the East Wing in the 1850s. He discovered that sound behaved strangely there. Whispers in one corner could be heard clearly across the hall, while shouts in the center seemed to vanish into silence. He noted, too, that certain doors refused to align properly, shifting slightly each day as though the very architecture resisted being mapped. Holloway's most unsettling discovery came one autumn evening when he placed 4 clocks in separate rooms of the wing. At precisely midnight, each clock stopped, its hands frozen, though the mechanisms showed no sign of damage. When wound again, the clocks resumed as if nothing had happened. Holloway published his findings in a small journal, concluding that Blackwood Manor contained peculiarities of resonance and magnetism. Yet he admitted that the simultaneous stopping of clocks had no explanation, and though he remained skeptical of ghosts, he confessed privately to colleagues that the house possessed an intelligence unfriendly to measurement. For every rational attempt to chart the manor's anomalies, folklore supplied its own darker explanation. Villagers spoke of the Blackwood line as cursed from the moment Lord Alistair laid the first stone, a punishment for dealings with secret societies that sought to harness unholy power. Some whispered that he had bargained his family's souls for wealth, that every disappearance was a toll demanded by his pact. Others believed the house itself had been born wrong, its foundations laid upon ground that resisted habitation, as though the earth itself rejected its presence. While scholars debated hysteria and magnetism, the villagers simply said, the Blackwoods sold themselves, and the house collects the debt. The clash of explanations came to a head in 1872, when a joint investigation was attempted, an unusual collaboration between physicians, priests and natural philosophers who hoped that together they might reach the truth. They gathered in the grand dining hall one winter's night, their instruments and relics arrayed like weapons before battle. The physicians interviewed servants, noting symptoms of nervous collapse and fainting fits. The priests sprinkled holy water at each threshold, muttering prayers. The scientists placed lenses and prisms in windows, measuring the angles of moonlight. For a time all was calm, but at midnight a violent disturbance broke their composure. The great chandelier, which had hung for nearly a century, began to sway violently, though no wind stirred. The clocks along the walls stopped as one, their ticking silenced. The candles guttered and died, plunging the hall into darkness. In the confusion, one of the investigators, a young assistant named Harold Finch, collapsed, gasping as though choking on invisible smoke. When light was restored, he was dead, his face frozen in terror. No cause could be determined, and the collaboration dissolved in acrimony. The physicians blamed the priests for inducing hysteria. The priests accused the scientists of arrogance that invited the devil's mockery, and the scientists dismissed both, insisting that unknown natural forces were at play. Yet none could deny that Finch was gone, and that the manor had claimed another victim. Psychology continued to wrestle with the tragedies, debating whether they stemmed from hereditary madness within the Blackwood line or from the trauma of living in a place steeped in fear. Some theorists suggested that the manor itself was irrelevant, that the family's reputation created a self-fulfilling prophecy of breakdowns and deaths. Others argued that trauma could echo across generations, leaving descendants predisposed to visions and neuroses. Yet each attempt to reduce the curse to mere psychology faltered against the sheer number of inexplicable events. The disappearing servants, the stopped clocks, the unaligned doors, the screams that echoed where no living throat could be found. By the end of the century, the manor had become a paradox. To scholars, it was an unsolved puzzle of acoustics, magnetism, and psychology. To priests, it was a battleground lost to infernal forces. To villagers, it was proof of a bargain sealed in blood. Each group had failed to impose its certainty upon the house. Science had measured but not explained. Religion had prayed but not cleansed. And the villagers, though fearful, had always been resigned, for they claimed to know what the others would not admit. That Blackwood Manor was not simply a building, but a hunger, a presence that neither microscope nor crucifix could banish. The failure of both science and superstition left only the voices of survivors, those few who had lived long enough to tell their accounts. Their stories were inconsistent, fractured by fear and memory, yet they carried the weight of lived experience that neither laboratory nor pulpit could dismiss. They spoke of footsteps that followed with no source, of rooms that seemed to breathe, of mirrors that reflected not faces but blurred shadows. And though skeptics continued to demand proof, the testimonies lingered, woven into the very fabric of the manor's legend. For in Blackwood Manor, proof was always elusive, but terror was undeniable. Survivors of Blackwood Manor are rare, and rarer still are those willing to speak of what they endured. Their testimonies, scattered across decades, form a chorus of fractured voices that defy easy explanation, too sincere to dismiss outright, too inconsistent to weave into a single narrative, yet each carrying a note of terror that lingers long after the words are spoken. To the skeptical outsider, these accounts appear as hallucinations, exaggerations born of trauma and fear. But to those who have looked into the eyes of the survivors, their trembling hands, their voices breaking as they recall what they swore they heard or saw, there is no mistaking that something unspeakable pressed against the fabric of their sanity within those cursed walls. The first recorded survivor testimony came from Margaret Hale, a maid who served briefly in the manor during the early 1800s. Margaret was known among villagers as sensible, unshaken by superstition, but when she emerged pale and trembling after just 3 nights in service, she spoke of an encounter that would mark her for life. Assigned to the East Wing, she had been instructed never to open certain locked doors, yet as she carried linens down the hall, she heard a voice call her name. Startled, she swore it was her own voice, perfectly identical, whispering from behind the locked oak door at the corridor's end. Terrified, she fled, but the whispers followed her down the hall, repeating her words before she spoke them, as if mocking her speech. Dismissed by doctors as the product of stress, her account nonetheless spread through the village, fueling rumors that the manor housed not spirits of strangers but echoes of its occupants, voices stolen and replayed until the boundary between self and other dissolved. In the decades that followed, more survivors would emerge, each adding layers of horror to the manor's reputation. One particularly chilling testimony came from Thomas Redgrave, a soldier who had returned from the Crimean War with medals for valor but scars that haunted his sleep. Seeking quiet work away from the city, he accepted a caretaker's position at Blackwood Manor in the 1850s. For months, he managed the grounds without incident, dismissing local stories as provincial nonsense. But one winter night he wandered into the East Wing, curious about the sealed rooms. Later, he swore that within those rooms he saw memories of his own life replayed before him, his comrades dying in battle, his mother's last smile, the moment he first held his infant daughter. Yet these visions twisted, changing details in ways he could not reconcile. His mother's eyes turned black, his comrades' mouths stretched in unnatural laughter, his daughter's face melted into ash. Redgrave emerged days later, disoriented and broken, claiming that the house had rewritten his memories, as though it were stealing ownership of them. He never returned to the manor, retreating to London where he spent his final years in a hospital for the mentally unwell. Physicians diagnosed his visions as traumatic hallucinations, the scars of war transposed onto a suggestible mind. But villagers whispered that the manor had consumed his past, reshaping it into something grotesque. Not all survivors spoke of visions. Some described sensations too strange for language. In 1879, Clara Whitcomb, a governess employed briefly by the Blackwood heirs, testified that she felt the house breathe. At night, lying awake in her chamber, she swore the walls expanded and contracted, a deep inhalation followed by a suffocating exhale. Sometimes the rhythm matched her own breathing until she could not tell whether she inhaled first or the house did. On one occasion, she said, she woke gasping to find the plaster of the ceiling pressing downward, as though the room itself had drawn breath and now sought to crush her. Dismissed as hysteria, Clara left her position and never worked again, convinced that the manor had tried to draw her life into its lungs. Her account, published in a small local paper, inspired speculation among occultists that the house was not haunted in the conventional sense, but alive in a parasitic way, feeding on those who dwelled within. Equally disturbing were the accounts involving mirrors, objects already central to the manor's dark lore. Survivors repeatedly described mirrors that failed to reflect them properly, faces blurred, eyes missing, features rearranged into grotesque parodies. In 1887, Henry Caldwell, a visiting scholar intrigued by the manor's reputation, wrote of standing before a mirror in the East Wing and seeing not his own reflection but that of a decayed corpse wearing his clothes. The image moved when he did, but its eyes stared back with malicious independence. He smashed the mirror in terror, only to find no shards on the floor, as if the glass had absorbed the blow. Weeks later, Caldwell fell gravely ill, insisting that the mirror had not been broken, but that part of me remained trapped within. He survived his illness but never recovered his sanity, muttering endlessly about the other Henry, who still wandered the manor's halls. Psychologists who studied these testimonies argued that they were classic cases of trauma-induced hallucination, amplified by the manor's reputation. The human mind, they said, could project fears into sensory experiences, particularly in environments already associated with dread. Survivors like Margaret, Redgrave, Clara, and Caldwell had entered the house expecting strangeness, and thus their minds produced it. Yet critics of this view pointed out that the details were often too consistent across decades, too similar in their themes of echoing voices, distorted memories, and parasitic architecture to be dismissed as coincidence. How, they asked, could so many unrelated individuals report mirrors that failed to reflect them, or rooms that seemed to breathe, if the experiences were merely private hallucinations? Priests, unsurprisingly, saw the survivors' accounts as proof of demonic infestation, voices that mimicked the living, memories twisted into grotesque parodies, the sensation of being consumed. These were, they argued, hallmarks of infernal deception. They warned that the manor trapped not only bodies but also souls, that each survivor carried a fragment of the curse within them afterward. Several survivors were even subjected to exorcisms, though none claimed relief. Indeed, some reported feeling worse afterward, as if the ritual had angered the house rather than cleansed it. Occultists, meanwhile, saw in the testimonies evidence of forbidden knowledge. They believed the manor acted as a vessel or conduit, amplifying echoes of human consciousness beyond death. Margaret's self-mimicking voice, Redgrave's rewritten memories, Clara's breathing walls, Caldwell's corrupted reflection, all pointed, they argued, to a place where the boundaries between self and other, life and death, were dangerously thin. To them, the house was not cursed but gifted, though monstrously so, a site where the veil of ordinary perception had worn away, exposing the raw machinery of existence. Thrill-seekers of the late 19th century flocked to hear these theories, some even bribing caretakers for entry into the manor, hoping to experience their own brushes with the uncanny. Public fascination grew, deepened by newspapers eager for sensational copy. Survivors became reluctant celebrities, their haunted faces printed alongside lurid headlines. Governess claims house breathes. Veteran's mind rewritten by cursed manor. Scholar sees his own corpse in mirror. Yet while skeptics mocked these tales as madness or fraud, others saw in the survivors' trembling sincerity something that could not be easily dismissed. Villagers, who had long avoided the manor, began to speak of it with renewed dread, warning outsiders that curiosity was a poor shield against its hunger. The survivors themselves rarely lived long, many succumbing to illness, madness, or accidents in the years following their encounters. Some suggested that survival was only temporary, that the house marked those it spared, drawing them slowly back to it in body or in spirit. One chilling rumor claimed that several survivors were later seen wandering the manor's grounds long after their supposed deaths, their eyes empty, their movements mechanical, as though the house had reclaimed them in the end. Thus the accounts of the living blurred into speculation about the dead, feeding the legend of Blackwood Manor as a place where voices, memories, and reflections could be stolen, distorted, or consumed. For every rational explanation offered, hallucination, trauma, hysteria, there remained details too chilling to dismiss. And for every supernatural theory proposed, demonic, occult, parasitic, there lingered the inescapable fact that no one who entered those forbidden rooms ever emerged unchanged. Survivors proved that life could continue beyond the manor, but their broken testimonies also proved that survival came at a terrible cost. And as their voices spread beyond the village, they drew the attention of academics, occultists, journalists, and thrill-seekers alike, each eager to interpret, exploit, or debunk what the survivors had endured. Yet none could escape the same conclusion. Whatever haunted Blackwood Manor was not easily dismissed. It was not only the dead who spoke from behind locked doors, but the living themselves, their sanity unraveling into testimonies that left more questions than answers. Science and superstition had both failed to resolve the mystery, but the survivors ensured it would never be ignored. The deeper the history of Blackwood Manor was examined, the less it yielded clarity. Each attempt to explain its horrors seemed to unravel into contradictions, theories collapsing into one another like echoes bouncing endlessly through a cavern. For the skeptical, the human mind remained the root of all mysteries. For the faithful, the soul was under siege by darker powers. And for those who dared step closer to the walls of the manor, it became impossible to dismiss the unsettling possibility that the house itself had a will, an intelligence, and perhaps even a hunger of its own. From the very first official inquests, rationalists took center stage. Physicians of the early 19th century, eager to align themselves with modern science, pored over the reports of screams, hallucinations, and shadowy visions, and declared them to be products of madness, grief, or hysteria. Some argued that Lady Eleanor's death could be traced to postpartum instability, a mind weakened by childbirth, imagination fed by grief, paranoia blooming into visions of phantoms. Others suggested epileptic seizures, known to trigger both hallucinations and wild fits of terror. In their eyes, the East Wing was no crypt of demons, but merely the theater of a broken mind playing to an empty audience. Later researchers, armed with instruments of chemistry, took a more material approach. By mid-century, theories of environmental poisoning had emerged. Surveyors claimed that the manor's walls concealed traces of toxic mold, the infamous Stachybotrys chartarum, whose spores could wreak havoc on the nervous system. Hallucinations, paranoia, and sudden fear, they argued, were all explainable through long-term exposure. Some spoke of mercury leaching from antique paints and furnishings, seeping into the bloodstream of those who lived there, gnawing at their sanity. Others whispered of natural gas leaks from fractured pipes beneath the foundations, invisible but lethal, filling the lungs and tricking the brain into visions. Rationalists held to these explanations with stubborn conviction. To them, the whispers of the house were not the voices of the dead but the poisoned voices of the living. And yet for every neat scientific answer, new questions surfaced. The theory of mold, for instance, failed to account for the way screams were heard by multiple witnesses at once, sometimes across different wings of the manor. Could mass hallucinations occur so precisely, aligning so seamlessly across several minds? Gas leaks could explain fainting spells, but how did they explain clocks halting simultaneously, their gears frozen as if time itself had been struck down? The scientific answers had the air of plausibility, but none could pierce the heart of the mystery. It was this uncertainty that allowed older, more primal explanations to regain their ground. Long before the manor was erected, the land itself bore whispers of blood. Local folklore insisted that the Blackwood estate was built upon the site of a pagan burial ground, a circle of stones where ancient rites were performed to honor gods long abandoned. Shepherds claimed they had seen firelight flicker among the trees at night, shadows of cloaked figures bowing before cairns of skulls. To the villagers, it was inevitable that the house carried the weight of that soil, that whatever powers had been bound there had not been silenced, but only transformed. The cries heard in the east wing were not of one woman's madness, but of the dead stirring restless beneath the stones. The Blackwoods themselves, with their air of cold detachment and whispered secrets, became fuel for darker imaginings. Among the townsfolk, it was said that the family had once sought wealth and influence beyond mortal means. The manor's oldest chapel was rumored to host blood rites, candles arranged in geometric circles, Latin prayers twisting into something older, sharper, unholy. Children swore they saw robed figures wandering through the windows at night, and more than one farmer swore that when he passed by the manor's gates, the air grew colder, the trees bent inward, and his horse refused to step forward. In this framing, the Blackwoods had not been victims of madness but architects of damnation, buying their power with oaths no church could sanctify. By the late 19th century, as occult societies flourished across Europe, Blackwood Manor found itself at the center of new, stranger claims. Spiritualists believed the building itself was no ordinary construction. They argued it was alive, a sentient house, each brick absorbing not just sound and light but human suffering. In this theory, the manor functioned like a mirror, reflecting not what one was but what one most feared. A maid who dreaded betrayal would hear her own voice whispering treachery from behind a locked door. A soldier who feared losing his memories would feel his mind unravel, as though the corridors rewrote his past. The architecture itself became the experiment. Corridors that narrowed without explanation, staircases that led to sealed walls, rooms whose dimensions shifted depending on who entered them. It was not merely the dead who were trapped, claimed these occultists, but the living themselves. The house fed on their doubts, their sins, their private terrors. To enter Blackwood Manor was to step into a confessional without forgiveness, a mirror without mercy. Where science saw gas and mold, the mystics saw a labyrinth designed by something far older than human hands. Still, the contradictions multiplied. If toxic spores caused hallucinations, why did animals too react with fear at the manor's gates? Horses refused to pass. Dogs barked themselves hoarse before retreating. If gas leaks were to blame, why did no explosion ever occur despite lamps and lanterns burning for decades within its halls? Conversely, if the manor were a living entity, how did one explain the meticulous architectural records proving that every wall, every dimension, matched its blueprint? The house seemed to laugh at each theory, producing just enough evidence to tempt belief and just enough anomaly to leave doubt gnawing at the edges. As decades passed, the competing myths hardened into factions. Rationalists clung to their explanations of poisoned bodies and weakened minds, dismissing villagers as hysterical and occultists as charlatans. The faithful saw in the failures of science the hand of the devil himself, the manor standing as a monument to the wages of sin. And the mystics, drawn to its darkness, declared it a liminal place, a wound in the earth where the natural and supernatural bled together. What is perhaps most chilling is not the divide between these explanations, but their convergence. In each theory, whether scientific or occult, the victims were transformed into something less than themselves, minds fractured, souls ensnared, identities stripped bare. Whether by mercury poisoning, pagan curses, or the hunger of the house itself, the end was the same. Those who entered Blackwood Manor did not leave whole. And so the theories multiplied endlessly, each contradicting the next, each bearing the conviction of truth and the fragility of myth. One scholar argued that the human brain, deprived of stable light and sound, invents its own horrors. Another claimed the acoustics of the East Wing were tuned, intentionally or not, to amplify whispers into screams. Yet another suggested that centuries of suffering had left a psychic residue, a haunting not of ghosts but of grief itself. And always in the background the villagers whispered, "No theory matters, for the house itself is watching." In the end, the only certainty was uncertainty. Blackwood Manor refused to yield to science or faith, reason or superstition. It stood as a monument to contradiction, where every explanation frayed at the edges, leaving only more questions. Rationalists pointed to spores and leaks, occultists to blood and sacrifice, mystics to sentience and mirrors. Each theory was sharpened against its opposite, each fed by both the failures and the fears of those who came before. And still the house endures, sealed now, its windows shuttered, its gates chained. Blackwood Manor looms over the village with silent defiance. Whatever truth lies buried in its walls remains untouched, waiting. Was it poisoned air or poisoned souls? Mold spores or memories of the damned? A trick of the architecture? Or the slow heartbeat of a house that thinks? No theory can silence the fact that the manor still stands, a sentinel of shadows, watching all who dare glance toward its broken towers. It waits, patient, indifferent to reason or superstition. It knows that in the end, those who seek answers will come. And when they do, Blackwood Manor will be ready. Blackwood Manor stands as it always has, its silhouette rising from the hill like a scar against the horizon. Seasons pass, years accumulate, yet the house refuses to surrender to ruin. Its windows remain dark, their glass like watching eyes. Certain doors are still bound with heavy chains, as though silence alone cannot contain whatever waits within. The villagers say that even now the rooms are never still. At night, when the wind cuts across the moors, footsteps can be heard in the upper halls, pacing endlessly, as if retracing tragedies no living witness can recall. Some claim to hear faint knocks from the boarded windows, like restless fingers tapping from the other side. The manor resists time not because it is preserved, but because it is unfinished, locked in the cycle of secrets and fear. What lingers is the question that no historian, no priest, no skeptic has ever resolved. Were the Blackwoods themselves victims, torn apart by madness, grief, and poisoned belief? Or were they the architects of something darker, weaving their rituals and obsessions into the bones of the house until it could never be free? Was Lady Eleanor's scream the cry of a mind undone, or the warning of someone who had glimpsed too much? Did the East Wing swallow her, or did belief itself shape the horror that consumed her? Each answer leads only to another riddle, and the house continues to stand as a monument not to truth, but to unending contradiction. Perhaps the real terror of Blackwood Manor is not what occurred, but what belief can summon. If enough minds insist the walls breathe, do they not in some way begin to breathe? If enough voices whisper of footsteps, is it madness to hear them in the dark? The power of the manor may lie not in stone or shadow, but in the imagination it awakens. A reminder that what we fear, we also give life to. And once given, that life is not easily reclaimed. Still, the most unsettling thought is the simplest. Perhaps the truth was buried with Lord Blackwood, sealed beneath the earth where no light or scholar's pen can reach. Or perhaps the truth was never buried at all, but waits in the silence of the manor, listening, gathering, shaping itself for the next soul bold enough or foolish enough to step across its threshold. For though its gates are chained, its story is not finished. The house abides as patient as stone, as merciless as memory. So the question falls not on the dead, but on the living. Would you enter Blackwood Manor knowing its history, its whispers, its shifting shadows? Would you step into its corridors and face the possibility that what you believe could make itself real? Or would you, like so many before, choose instead to keep its doors sealed, leaving the house to watch in silence, waiting for the day someone answers its call?